I thought I would get to the lawyer's office early, but by the time my lawyer showed up and we were shown into the conference room, Dave and his lawyer were already there. This caused the jealous reaction that always came over me when I saw him interact with a beautiful woman. I suspected that deep down I always felt a little inferior to him. He was a brilliant catch for any woman. At 48, he was handsomer than at 20, tall and muscular, owned his own successful business, and headed the local chamber of commerce. I shuddered at the thought that if today didn't go well, I would never feel his large, soothing arms again. Dave barely glanced at me as I followed my lawyer into the room. My face, I know, turned pale when the slim, red-haired, classically beautiful lawyer bitch reached out and squeezed my husband's left forearm, just above the wrist, as a gesture of reassurance that she was there for him. Officially, she was just reassuring the client. However, I interpreted it as, "Let's get this crap out of the way so I can dump you as a client and check out that bulge in your pants." I knew from long experience that if this happened, she would be in for a great pleasure. My husband was gifted better than most, and knew how to use it. Dave turned to her and smiled his bright, familiar, cheerful smile, but his face was neutral as he looked at me. I wanted to throw myself at his feet and scream that istupid who will spoil him for the rest of his life, if only he will forgive me one serious mistake I made in our 28-year marriage. But frustrated by Dave's determination not to talk to me at all, I was forced to go to this meeting. My lawyer started chatting with the red-head bitch, and I sat down in the seat. Pause it, Davy, took a folder out of my large pursy, opened it, and laid out the finished 2-page script in front of me. I looked up and saw Dave smiling faintly. Having known me for 30 years, he knew that I prepared in advance for everything important. He opened the laptop that lay on the table in front of him before plugging in a pair of small speakers, then placed a single sheet of paper next to it. Then, very casually, he put his hands on the table and looked at me with a terribly polite face. Absolutely insensitive. No anger, no hate, no grief. There is nothing. I prepared for this meeting for 3 days and knew my script by heart. I used my intimate knowledge of David Brown to fit in and tug at his heartstrings. Well, we all know why we are here. The defendant, Mrs. Julianne Brown, agreed to sign a divorce petition if my client, David Brown, would listen to her for at least 1 hour. If everyone is ready, I suggest that the hour begin now. She turned the knob of the small kitchen timer on the table in front of her. It began to tick loudly, emphasizing the silence in the room. I was annoyed that Dave would not agree to a private meeting, but insisted on having lawyers present. I was going to bare my soul for the next 45 minutes before I forced Dave to admit that he had done something to partially justify my inappropriate behavior. It's all quite awkward when it's just the two of us present, all the more humiliating in front of strangers. Well, there's no point in dwelling on the negatives. I had no choice. I glanced at my completely unnecessary notes on the table and crossed my fingers. My friend Sonia used my opening gambit to talk her husband into not kicking her out when he caught her cheating. "Their ego is damaged," she said. "Start with repairs." I cleared my throat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me today, Dave. I would just like to say from the very beginning that I was wrong for what I did, and it didn't have to do with any failure on your part, but it all came down to me being self-centered, selfish. It took me days of introspection to come to this conclusion, and I knew Dave would appreciate my honesty. It was very important to make it look like I was taking all the blame before subtly placing the thoughts he might be bringing into his head. I firmly believed that Dave wanted to forgive me with all his heart, but he needed an excuse to do so. My whole speech was aimed at giving him this justification. If the kids were at home, I would play the "Oh, Dave, you can't break up the family" card, which would be a guaranteed success. I looked at his face to see how he took my speech and was stunned by his reaction. In the ticking silence of the room, Dave's expression remained neutral. He didn't even look at me. He simply raised his pen and placed a check mark next to the first sentence of his notes. It almost completely confused me. With my first words, I obviously said exactly what he expected me to say, and this shook my confidence. In my arrogance, I forgot that not only had I come up with my argument based on 30 years of knowing him, but he had spent those 30 years looking back at me. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was shocked. Well, you have to continue to stick to your script. Like I said, Dave, this was all because of me and some stupid, selfish decisions I made. I felt lost without children, and a little old, unattractive, and useless when I met Jason while working on a church committee. He was sophisticated and obviously a skilled seducer. He knew exactly which buttons to press and when. He started pretending that he was just a friend, listening to all my problems after church meetings. It was last year when you were away often. But one day we were leaving the church right after the meeting, and Jason suggested we go to a cafe. And I stupidly agreed. It all seemed so harmless, and he seemed like a good friend. So I didn't realize that he was very skilled at getting under a woman's protection. Well, coffee shops led to restaurants, where he complained that his wife didn't understand him. I know it's an old cliche, but by then I trusted him. The restaurants became more and more luxurious. The gifts he bought me became more and more pleasant. Oh, Dave, you have no idea how nice it is when a guy 15 years younger than you tries to woo you. But you would be proud of me, because 4 months ago he asked me to sleep with him, and I refused him. I know I should have refused to meet him after that, when his intentions were clear and all, but by then I had become somewhat dependent on the effect his compliments and attention had on my ego and confidence. I fell silent and sniffled, rubbing my eyes with the finger I had previously rubbed on the piece of onion in my pocket. It stung so much that I didn't dare rub my other eye. One eye with tears flowing from it should have been enough. I stopped, started again, faltered, and hesitated. Oh, honey, I'm so ashamed that I didn't break up with him. He took me to a restaurant and bought a bottle of Grange for $300, although he himself does not drink wine. Instead of wasting it, I drank almost all of it. I'm pretty sure that's what he wanted. I was too nervous to resist him when we left the restaurant. He offered to take me home, and I foolishly agreed. Once in the driveway, he leaned over and kissed me, but I was too drunk to stop him. You know how I feel after a couple glasses of wine. Then he started rubbing my, breasts. At this point, my logic was completely broken, and I remember just thinking that I should move him out of the driveway so the neighbors wouldn't see us. For the same reason, I opened the garage door and forced him to park inside. I cheated a little by admitting that even in the car, I thought Jason might be staying a while, and I certainly didn't want the neighbors to see a strange car in the driveway the next morning. But it was all a calculated risk on my part. I knew enough about men in general to know that being cuckolded was a major blow to a man's ego, and I wanted Dave to make sure no one else ever found out about it. Well, except for 2 lawyers. Well, Jason got out of the car as the garage door was closing and started kissing me again. As I said, I had already drunk most of the bottle of Grange and was ripe for plucking. He grabbed my key and led me inside. I took him to one of the spare bedrooms, and I will be ashamed of this until the day I die. I let him do whatever he wanted with me. I'm so sorry, Dave. My only saving grace was that I was composed enough with him to get him to put on a condom. After Jason, came, I think we both fell asleep. I because I was drunk, and he because he must have been tired after a 4 or 5 month chase. I know for sure I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't drunk and depressed when I woke up, and I definitely would have kicked him to the curb immediately. Instead, you entered. When you entered the room and turned on the light, I have never been so ashamed in my life. The look of pain on your face just killed me. I realized how much harm I caused to you and us with one simple mistake. With tears still flowing from one eye, I turned my pleading gaze to my husband. Having spent a lifetime together, I knew that I could read his expression like an open book and be able to judge how my request was going. Not true. His expression remained neutral. In fact, he didn't even look at me. Strange, but he was fiddling with the damn laptop in front of him. I thought he was writing notes until he clicked the link on his screen. A voice came from the speakers. My voice. Ugh, don't kiss me. You reek of beer. What about you, rotten grape breath? What? I had one lousy glass of white. The audio clip stopped, and the room fell into a thunderous silence. I think that's how it was. The roaring sound in my head drowned out everything else. Yes, I felt embarrassed and humiliated when Dave walked in on me that night with Jason, before lifting Jason by his hair and beating the crap out of his naked body. But that was insignificant compared to the fact that I had just been caught in a huge lie. This completely threw me off track. I was so confident that my script would work. My eyes darted around the room. Dave's lawyer smiled slightly. Mine looked slightly embarrassed. Dave just looked at me expectantly with that damn blank expression. Later, I will never understand why I didn't immediately realize what it all meant. What the heck? Dave had an audio recording of my meeting with Jason that night. Being wound up, it never occurred to me to follow the logic of this. Why does he need a voice recorder there if he didn't know in advance that he could record something? What else did we say? The silence stretched uncomfortably for a long time, and I looked at the cryptic shorthand of my notes and, looking back stupidly, plunged into the script I had prepared. I clung to him like a drowning man clings to the rubble. It was only once. It would never happen again, nothing like that. Please believe me. I just wasn't strong enough to resist him, but I wasn't so out of control that I wouldn't force him to use a condom or let him take me on our bed. He wanted it. But I would never do that, no matter how drunk I was. We were in Megan's old room, weren't we? Dave just looked at me sadly, and I didn't know what was worse, his sad face or his impassive one. He shook his head and turned to the computer. I felt, rather than hear him double-click the icon, and I cringed until, I just like to watch how you lie in front of me, full of desire. It is very hot. Then, once it's finished, another double-click, and Jason's voice again. When can we have sex again in your clueless husband's bed? It was so cool. This time Dave clicked and ended the clip and then just looked at me, silently. Accusatory. What could I say? All the shit I said was thrown out of the water. Not by Dave, but in my own words. Condoms. It was a one-time drunken mistake. Not cuckold my husband in his own bed. The whole thing was exposed as a lie in just 30 words. Stand, stand, stand. I'm speechless. Although it was awkward, I looked at Dave for some clue. His neutral gaze still gave nothing away. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my lawyer glance at her watch. It forced me to focus on the loudly ticking timer and the realization that the 60 minutes I'd bought to try and get my marriage back together were going by quickly, and, I must admit, spectacularly poorly. I forced myself to suppress my panic. Sorry for the lie, Dave, about the fact that it was the first time. I just didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had. I thought that if I could convince you that this was just a one-time thing, and for exactly the reason I said, you wouldn't be so offended. I stumbled back to silence. Should I now admit that I dated Jason several times a week for over 6 months? The trouble was, I didn't know what Dave knew. He knew from recorded conversations that the night he walked in on Jason and me wasn't the first or only night, but what else did he know? The fact that he hid the recorder where I usually did with Jason suggested that he was suspicious at least one more time. I just didn't know. However, I knew that if I was caught telling one more lie, it would all be over. Well, Juliana, old lady, it's time to be vague. Avoid details and stick to the facts. The truth is that Jason did seduce me, and it took a while. He has a soft spot for older women, and it's true that a woman my age gets a huge ego boost being pursued by a man almost her children's age, and I just wasn't strong enough to fight back. I admit it. I was weak. I thought about telling him that I had only used the master bed once, and that was the first time. It would be a lie, but one that would put me in a much better light. But I kept coming back to the fact that I had no idea how long Dave had known about my extramarital activities. I decided to remain silent about this. Stand, stand, stand. However, I cannot remain silent on all issues. I had very little time to change this catastrophic situation. Not knowing what to do, I looked at my notes. Having discarded the first few points after I was exposed, I focused on a couple of words that I highlighted in capital letters. But I never stopped loving and respecting you, Dave. I have never given you less love than I always have. Jason was just an extra dimension to my life that didn't take anything away from you. Just overflowing, if I can describe it that way. When I fell silent, Dave looked back at his laptop screen. He frowned. He seemed to have difficulty finding something, and for a split second his expression changed from neutral to confused, but then he relaxed again. Hearing the recording, a continuation of the soundtrack he had made earlier, I realized that his frown meant that he was looking for an icon on the screen, before realizing that it was one of the already open files. It would be better if he didn't understand this. He clearly started over from the very beginning of the video. I listened again to Jason's question about fucking me in my marital bed. Just like the first time, I cringed. Once again, my own words condemned me. I already told you, never again. Not after the last time Dave stepped out of the shower that night and stood on a large drop of white. Thank God Dave swallowed my story about how I sneezed and it was snot. I sank even lower into the seat knowing what words would come next. I felt smug as I said them, but that was no longer the case. But the fact that I offered to clean his leg, and then knelt down and did it nicely, distracted him. You have to admit, doll, that your husband sometimes acts like an ignorant idiot. How we got away with it was that time he came home early, and I had to hide in the closet. What a moron. Yes, but he's mind jerk. When we first started our case here, I thought it was sweet that he trusted me so much that he never saw even the most obvious evidence. Now, however, I agree with you. He is just an ignorant fool. Sometimes I wonder if you and I could have sex right here while he was in the room and see if he noticed. The mockery in my voice, as well as the words themselves, made me realize that I was beating a dead horse here. With these words and such a tone, I couldn't even convince myself that I loved and respected my husband, let alone him. Once again, I was thrown into a steady tailspin of confusion. Before this meeting, I convinced myself that I loved and respected Dave, but after what I did and said, how is that possible? Steep, steep, steep. In the ticking, tense silence after the final nail in my coffin, Dave turned to look at me. I couldn't look him in the face, so I turned to his lawyer. There was such contempt on her face that I even shuddered. If I had any doubts that Dave was more than just another client to her, they were blown away by the emotion in that expression. I looked away from her and now looked at my lawyer. She also wasn't quick enough to hide her disdain. And here I am, in a room, fighting for my future, surrounded by people who think I'm something they stepped into at the dog park, and one of them should be on my side. My confidence evaporated like dew in the midday sun. My self-esteem wasn't far behind. Maybe that's why I looked at my notes again and decided to go on the offensive. You have to admit, Dave, that over the last 6 months or so you've been paying me less and less attention, taking me for granted, going out of town on business more and more, and, dare I say it, moving away from me. And all this at the same time when the children left home and I felt lost. You were never there when I needed you. You didn't tell me that I wasn't as old and unattractive as I felt. You weren't there to comfort me when I needed it most. I paused and Dave's eyes went back to his damn screen. His fingers danced again and I cringed. The file he selected opened as Jason spoke. I realized it was just after our second round that terrible night, shortly before Dave broke us up. Sorry, doll, but we haven't been together for almost 2 weeks. Ooh, you know I like it rough. No, seriously, 2 weeks is too long. Can't we see each other more often? Oh, stop whining. It's been 2 weeks for me too, and I have needs too, especially after you asked me to cut down on Dave's diet. He had a 3-day trip planned last week, and we could have sneaked out somewhere, but the trip was canceled at the last minute. You only got me tonight because of an urgent meeting he had to go to. I would also like him to leave town more often, my dear, believe me. Well, I want more, said an irritated Jason. You will get what I give you. Once again, the clip was interrupted. Ashamed, I lowered my eyes to the table to avoid 3 judgmental glances and remembered my state during the last conversation. The truth was that the novelty of having a lover, even one as young and energetic as Jason, was beginning to wear on. Jason and my actions in betraying my husband had caused me to lose respect for Dave, and it was at least beginning to prick my conscience. Loss of respect. More than anything else, I think, was the reason for my emotional distance from my husband. Even as I prepared for this meeting, fully intending to blame him for pulling away from me, I realized that it was a lie. To allow myself to continue to betray him, I emotionally divorced Dave. Cutting him off in bed was an easy decision, simply because Dave's lovemaking was so different from Jason's impatience that it was impossible to confuse the two. This reinforced to me that what I was doing was very, very wrong. So I began to reject my husband's advances. Well, he pressed for a while, then he stopped. I suddenly realized that it should have been screaming for my attention months ago. Dave suddenly gave up his sex life around the same time he began working longer hours and going away more often. At the time, I thought he was also emotionally distancing himself from me. I closed my eyes, now completely confused about who was distancing himself from who. And then something clicked. Dave must have known for a long time. That's why he knew he had to hide the recorder in Megan's room. Crap. My entire approach to this meeting was to minimize my crime, heal Dave's wounded pride, eat some humble shit, all to get my life back and the future I so desperately wanted. I thought I was calming a recently wounded bull, but if I was right about him knowing at least 2 weeks before he discovered, nay, confronted me, then he was a lot more cunning than I thought, and I was wasting my time calling to his emotions. Stand. In short, I had no idea what to do. I'm much better when I plan than when I'm spontaneous. Hence 2 pages of notes. But I had to do something. Time was running out. The ticking of the clock confirmed this. In desperation, I took my notes and began to look for hope. The pounding in my head made absorbing the words a very slow process. Nothing jumped out. Then I realized that the recordings were a red herring because the game had changed so much. If Dave knew I was leaving for a while, what was his state of mind? He, of course, was offended by my betrayal, but most of all, he was worried about my motivation. Wasn't I satisfied with the quantity and quality of his lovemaking? Do I find him boring and want to explore my kinky side? Did I love Jason? Was I really going to run away with him? I could correct these fears and doubts. I risked looking into those expressionless eyes, wondering if I should risk lying again. If only I could remember what else Jason and I talked about that fateful night. If only I could be sure that this was the only night David recorded. Of course, the sequence had to be suspect, install recorders, resist. He could not be sure of this for long. He just wasn't a good actor. I desperately wanted to convince him of the truth. I still loved and respected him. My desperate desire that he would not abandon me proved this. It was far beyond my fear of losing my very comfortable lifestyle. But how do I convince him that I respect him after we've all heard me call him an asshole in front of my lover? What's the point of trying to justify denigrating him to my lover as a soppy to my conscience and creating a common bond between Jason and me? Nothing that I could see. The same applied to love for him. If I had caught him deceiving me, the wild horses would not have been able to draw the conclusion out of me that he still loved me. So convincing him that I love and respect him will take time. I won time by convincing him not to insist that I immediately sign the divorce papers. But how long does that damn timer keep ticking to convince him of this? One thing was for sure, my next few sentences were going to score points. Lots of points. I gathered my courage and looked across the table at Dave. I know you feel like I've lost my love and respect for you, Dave, but I assure you I never did. I love you and our life together. I want to end my days with you, and only you. Seeing what life is like without you, and remembering the shame I felt when you caught me, I will control myself for the rest of my life. Of that you can be sure. Jason was a distraction. I didn't love him, and of course I never intended to run away with him. Yes, it was wrong, very wrong, especially in response to his offer to make love to you less. I really don't know why I went through with it, especially after I managed to convince myself that I was just giving him an excess that you can't handle. He had no more stamina in bed than you did at his age, and he was much less experienced and attentive. I was motivated by nothing but lust and selfishness. Yes, it felt good to be exhausted before my body lost interest in sex, but it was completely emotionless. It's not like I did all the perversions with him that I've denied you all these years. They say time slows down for those who are close to death. The breakdown of a marriage must have been the same because I saw everyone else in slow motion, even though I was at normal speed. My lawyer, sitting to my left, threw her pen on the table and turned to me, a look of absolute disgust crossing her face, proving that at this moment, I couldn't even pay someone to be on my side. Dave's lawyer leaned to the side to get a better view of the laptop screen. Then I realized that Dave was not playing sound files, as I had assumed, but video clips. Somehow, this made it even worse. A lawyer. She grabbed her husband's hand again as a sign of physical support. Dave's reaction couldn't have hurt more if he tried. Fortunately, he was not looking at me, but at the screen in front of him. His neutral expression disappeared, but only for a split second. You could see the devastation he must have felt when he discovered that the man who was supposed to have his back was betraying him. I saw how a single tear rolled out of the eye closest to me, how he suffered. Or did he toughen himself up by looking at the screen? The last remnants of my mind recorded a couple of now irrelevant facts. The recording was made at least 3 weeks before the collision, which meant that Dave had been watching me betray him for some time. Enough to see a pattern. We were all silent while the speakers played. It was so hot at the time, but now it just seemed dirty, sloppy and tasteless, empty. I stared at the table as my lawyer laid out the divorce papers in front of me. There was nothing I could do or say to combat the vile behavior that my husband, my Dave, had discovered in me. Then, with unsurpassed ease, he destroyed all my rationalizations, minimizations, and pathetic attempts at reconciliation. We're done. As an orchestra conductor, Dave didn't say anything today. He simply indicated in which section of the orchestra he wanted to play next, using his skills and talents. Dave didn't say a word, and he executed me. No, not Dave. I climbed up to the scaffold myself, put on my own blindfold, threw a noose and kicked the lever. Dave just built a scaffold and left. I realized that I didn't have a chance as soon as he turned on the last clip without hesitation and without looking. He knew exactly what I was going to say and when. I came up with my arguments based on my intimate knowledge of him after observing him for 3 decades. I had forgotten that he also looked at me for the same amount of time, looking back at me with her smart, penetrating eyes. The shame and humiliation were unbearable and finally caused me to run away. Escape was what I needed, running back to the house that was still my home, at least until Dave got the eviction notice. That was part of the agreement. An escape to children who I hope will never know and will continue to love me unconditionally. The only way to salvation lay through a receipt with the loss of most of my life. I took the pen, signed the 2 agreements, and threw it away in one fluid motion. I was surprised Dave's business wasn't worth more, but that's what my lawyer's assessment found. And of course, Dave had plenty of time to hide most of it. Son of a bitch. By this time, thankfully, the last recording had ended and the ticking silence returned. My lawyer took the signed papers and handed me 1 copy of this bitch and put the rest in her briefcase, got up, and left the room. I sat there, frozen, wanting to run, but wanting to leave with a positive message, an ember that will at least convince me that there is hope of someday rekindling the flame. Let Dave know that I still care about his well-being. Suddenly, the sharp sound of an alarm clock pushed me into action. I stood up and said my positive phrase. Now the jackal was holding Dave's hand with both hands. Don't waste your life by ending up in prison after taking revenge on Jason. Then I will never, never forgive myself for this. Dave's response to this was another bloody video. This time, fortunately, it was not my voice, but the voice of another woman. In an almost shrill voice, "What did this little freak do? He won't be able to have sex anymore if my brothers get to him first. Mrs. Jason, I believe. I thought Jason's silence after the beating was fear on his part. Now I'm thinking that he ended up divorced and left penniless was a fitting end for the scammer. Dying because he slept with me was another burden on my already overburdened conscience. I just couldn't look Dave in the face as I stood up to leave. Whether he had that damn expressionless face, whether he was laughing or crying, it all hurt me. Reminds me of what I did to this good man. He lost everything I had except my house and money, of course, and took a huge emotional hit to boot. And I was the cause of all this. I deserved everything he threw at me. Goodbye, dear. I squeezed out through tears, shuffling towards the door. My pathetic attempt to maintain my old life was cast aside like the plague beetle that it was. Maybe my daughter Megan will come visit me while I drink myself into oblivion. And if she is not available, then my son, Joel. I had just started to push the door when I heard voices behind me. It was another damn record. A clearly excited young male voice said, "Cheater!" "Are you sure, Dad?" A very familiar female voice intervened. "I think I'll drink alone today. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one.